This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, wherever you are. We have close to 100 registrations from people in Australia, South America, South Asia, many parts of Europe. So we're really happy that you could join us today. This seminar is organized as part of a project called Gifts from the Sentient Forest. This is a project based in northern Finland, specifically the area around the city of Rovaniemi. And it's a project exploring forest sentience. So the intelligent attributes of forests and how we can engage with those attributes through various creative means. So we're very happy you can join us for the seminar today, Attending to Plants, Botanical Intelligence and Phenomenology. And I think our two speakers show us. We have our first speaker representing the science of plant attention and phenomenology, and our second speaker representing the philosophy of plant attention and phenomenology. And it shows us how important this dialogue between science and philosophy is to our understanding of plants in the current age of incredible biodiversity loss around the world, an age where we are searching for alien intelligence, but in fact, the intelligence of plants is not so well understood as of yet. So we are at both an exciting and daunting moment in our world history and our relationship to plant life specifically. So thank you for joining us. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. You can tell us where you're from. Feel free to add some links to your work, kind of networking. We have an incredible range of expertise represented in our audience today. So please feel free to share a bit about yourselves. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker of today's seminar. So for over a decade, André Parise has studied the cognition and intelligence of plants, learning how these extraordinary organisms interact with their environment. He has developed the hypothesis of plant attention and extended plant cognition alongside a team of collaborators. André's PhD research at the University of Reading explores mycorrhizal symbioses and non-neural cognitive systems. So we're very pleased and honored to have André speaking from Brazil today. Thank you so much, André, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, John, for the introduction, and Francis for this exciting seminar. So everyone is hearing me well?
Yes, perfect, André, yes.
Good, thank you. So yeah, let's talk about this exciting topic, which is plant attention or attention in plants, which is something we've been developing in the last few years. So I'm currently based at the University of Reading, but most of the research I'm presenting here was developed at the Federal University of Pelotas in Brazil, specifically at the Laboratory for Plant Cognition and Electrophysiology from the University of Pelotas. So if you are watching this, let me see if I can change the slides. Yeah. Chances are that you already heard that plants and other organisms can be intelligent or cognitive. And in fact, there is a growing number of scientists that understand cognition not as a phenomenon linked specifically to the brain or to mammals, but actually as something more general that allows living organisms, so every kind of living organism, to interact with the environment in a dynamic and, in a sense, creative way that allows them to constantly adapt to the changes of the environmental conditions. So cognition would be a very widespread phenomenon, and actually every living form, every living being is cognitive by definition. There is no life without cognition. and which means that from bacteria to slime molds or mosses and fungi and even mammals and plants, every organism would be cognitive. However, all those branches of the tree of life have developed their own perceptive systems. They have their own body plans, their own organization of their bodies, which means that their cognition would be different. They would do the same things in a sense of keeping them alive and interacting with the world, but each one has their own way of doing that. And that's very exciting because we can start looking for which are the similarities and the differences and how each organism is cognitive its own way in its own terms. So that's not different for plants. And in fact, in the last 20 years, there has been a revival in studies on plant intelligence and plant cognition. This idea is not new. So the cognition of plants have been studied scientifically since at least the 19th century. But in the last 20, 25 years, there was this revival in plant cognition studies. And many cognitive behaviors have been described. For example, communication between plants, usually through volatile, so chemical substances they release in the air that allows them to communicate with other plants. This is even not new because those studies started in the 1980s. And so it's very clear nowadays that plants actually communicate. But they also can learn, they can store memories of experiences they had and use this information to deal better with the same situation when they face it again in the future. They can perceive the environment, make decisions, act by anticipation, and so on. So all of this have been described. However, surprisingly, there is one very, very important aspect of plant cognition that has been ignored in the scientific literature, which is attention. So attention as this cognitive phenomenon of selecting the most important stimuli or actions in the environment to respond to at the exclusion of others. Because every organism likely needs attention because all the stimuli the environment offers, even for us, is limited. We have many, many senses. We can perceive everything that is going on, but we can't respond to everything or we can't attend everything. So we have to direct our energy and our focus to what is more important. So attention is likely at the basis of all those cognitive behaviors that we observe in plants, but surprisingly, no one has ever talked about that, at least for my knowledge. And it is not surprising that plants would require attention because when we see what plants are capable of, what they perceive, they are exposed to a colossal amount of stimuli at the same time. Because plants first are modular, so we call modularity the fact that they are made of several repeated units, semi-autonomous units that interact in their own with the environment. And also, and very importantly, plants are rooted in the soil, so they are experiencing at the same time two different environments, completely different environments. One above ground where the shoot and leaves are exposed to light, to heat, to touch, wind, chemicals traveling in the air, herbivores grazing, and etc. And below ground, the same plant is experiencing lack of oxygen, soil compactation, nutrients, heavy metals, flooding, earthworms or pathogens, and all of this at the same time. So there is an immense amount of stimuli that plants are exposed to, and they have no brains, no neurons or any central processing unit to process all this. So how could they do that? However, we know that they do that because plants are quite successful evolutively. They've been around for 400 million years, even before animals started to come to the dry masses of the planet. So we just have to understand how they do it. So that's, for me, one of the most exciting topics about plant cognition is trying to understand how they do that. Part of this could be related to the modularity of plants. We can discuss it in a later occasion. But part of this could be because of attention. And so the first person to talk about plant attention, at least for my knowledge, was Michael Marder, who published, he's a philosopher, a phenomenologist, that published a paper in 2012 where he describes, he proposes a definition of attention that wouldn't exclude plants or any other organism a priori because they don't have brains. And he described attention as a disproportionate investment of physical or mental energy by an organism, tissue, or cell into a particular activity or into the reception of a singled out stimulus or set of stimuli. So basically, when there is a stimulus that requires the focus of energy, or mental energy, or even physical energy into that reception, into receiving that stimulus, or even into engaging with that stimulus, that would be attention. And that's very interesting because it doesn't require brains, and even not even a whole organism can be attentive, but also parts of organisms. So I like this hypothesis because it is very general. And when we observe plant behaviors, some of them likely would require attention. For example, blooming. When plants are flowering, when the bud is activated to become flowers, this process is irreversible. So all the resources of the plant, at least in that part of the plant, will be directed to forming the inflorescence with the flowers and ensuring pollination. So that's a very important process to complete a plant's life cycle. That likely requires attention. So it is investing all the energy into one thing despite variations in the environment. Another example could be climbing plants that have to perceive a potential support nearby and direct its movements and its actions towards the support to grip it to ensure they can keep growing. So they have to grow towards the support despite variations in wind, in lighting, in herbivores eating the leaves, and so on. Another more specific example could be the case of the Venus flytrap, this carnivorous plant, very famous, which has a set of bristles inside the trap that must be activated twice within 30 to 40 seconds to trigger the closing of the trap. So when an insect lands on the trap and hits one of those bristles, the plant has to keep the memory of the bristle that was touched previously and pay attention to the next hit so that it can close the trap. So this is also a behavior that potentially likely could require attention. But as a plant physiologist or ecophysiologist, I'm very interested not only in the behaviors of plants, so how they do it, but also what's underlying those behaviors, what underpins physiologically these behaviors. In other words, how could I observe attention empirically as a physiological phenomenon and not only as a behavioral phenomenon? And the response to that could be through the study of electrical signaling of those plants. So pretty much like animals, plants can produce electrical signals, very similar to those that we find in our brain cells, in the muscles. And this is also not new. This is known at least from the end of the 19th century. We had some important advancements in the early 20s with Sir Jagadish Chandra Bose, who developed several devices to study plant electrophysiology. And he showed that also like normal plants, not only exceptional plants like the Venus flytrap or the sensitive plant, produce those electrical signals. And nowadays we know that all parts of plants, all cells are able to produce electrical signals that travel throughout the plant's body. Usually for long distance integration, those signals travel through the vascular bundles because they connect the whole plant. And those signals bring and take information about what the plant is doing or perceiving. And they are, we know already that they are related to several physiological processes like activating photosynthesis, allowing symbionts to colonize the roots, or opening and closing the stomata, and so on. So apparently, everything that a plant perceives or does involves electrical signaling. And that's why we could study attention likely through those signals. And how we do it, the techniques per se are very simple. We basically can insert 2 electrodes in the plants using the same equipment we use for doing electrocardiograms or electroencephalograms. And we record all the variation of electrical signals. So basically all the electrical activity that happens between the 2 electrodes. And this is called the electron, the plant electron, which is here. So the electron is the collection of all signals that are happening in the plant at a certain stretch of time. And we record it as variations in electrical potential through time, obtaining a time series like this. And what we've been observing is that every time a plant receives a stimulus, this electron changes, the dynamics changes completely. And specifically should that stimulus the plant is receiving. So here at the right side, we can see the electron of soybean plants before and after receiving certain stimuli. So that's the baseline of the plant. Normally it has a certain activity, but after the plant's been stimulated with cold, with low light, or with mannitol, which is a sugar alcohol that causes drought, we see it changes dramatically after the stimulation. And those changes are very specific to that those stimuli. So we can use machine learning techniques to classify what the plant is perceiving. So that's very, very specific. It's not random. And that's why it's also very encouraging to study plant attention. But from where this idea comes from? So I did my master's research in Pelotas, in the Federal University of Pelotas, studying the dodder plant, the Cuscuta racemosa. This is this plant. It is a parasitic plant, very, very, very interesting plant that has no roots, no leaves. It barely produces any chlorophyll. So it lives by parasitizing host plants and attaching to and absorbing its sap. So that's me in 2019 studying this plant that was trying to take over the whole greenhouse. And so basically, since this plant needs to be attached to a host plant, otherwise it will die, I was interested in studying what would happen if I detach a branch of this plant and place it near a host, and like how it would change the electrical activity of this plant. Would this plant perceive there is a host nearby? Because for this plant, it is the most important thing to find a host as soon as possible once it is detached from its host plant. Otherwise, it will die in a few days. So the experiment consisted of putting some branches of this plant, some twigs, in a box with or without different host plants, and recording the electrical signaling of this parasitic plant, the dodder. And the results are very interesting because we found that first, they have a very lively electrical activity. Second, when we put a host near it, the electrical activity changes completely. So you can see down here, so up here is the baseline, down here is the activity after placing a bean plant, which is a very juicy plant that this parasitic plant loves to parasitize. So it changes when it perceives a host nearby, and also this change is specific to the host the plant perceives, because we put either a bean plant or a wheat plant, and the response would be different. So it shows that the plant, the dodder plant, recognizes different species from a distance. So this alone was a very interesting result, but we noticed something else. We noticed that the changes in the electron, after doing some mathematical analysis and statistical analysis, was changed in a specific pattern. So basically there was an increase in the energy of the signals there was a decrease in the complexity of those signals, accompanied because the signals were more regular, so they were more predictable. And this was accompanied by an increase in the correlation of the signals. So how much one signal would influence another, this correlation increased immensely. After placing a host nearby, after the daughter plant perceived a host near. And then he thought, maybe this plant could be paying attention to the host, perhaps, because first, the plant would be alone in the box, and there was no, there wasn't any important stimuli to direct the actions of this plant. Once the host was put into the box, all the actions of this plant had to be directed to grow in enriching this host, because this is a life or death matter. So for the plant, this would be very important. So this could be an indication of attention in the plant. And why specific this pattern? So why decreased complexity, increased regularity, increased correlation? This would be because of the modularity of plants that I mentioned before. So this is something very specific to plants. As I mentioned, plants are made of repeated semi-autonomous units. Usually above ground is a stem, a leaf, and a bud. So like in those beautiful roses, or even in this mint, it's very clear. So they're made of segments of stem, 1 or 2 leaves, or even more, and then the buds, axillary buds, and so on. And roots also are made by several small roots. And every part of the plant, every leaf, every stem, every module is semi-autonomous. That means that they can interact with the environment on their own and solve their own problems, usually. So what we observe as a plant behavior, as a whole plant behavior, is actually not a whole plant behavior, but the collection, the emergence of all the interactions of all the modules interacting with the environment. So, and that makes sense, because, for example, a leaf that is up in the plant's crown is exposed to excessive light. It could be exposed to excessive temperatures, or I don't know, wind or something. And the leaf has to solve these problems by opening or closing the stomata and so on. But those problems are very specific to the leaf. So there is no reason for root to be concerned about what the leaf individually is doing. So everyone have a loose integration, but they mostly can interact alone. However, there are a few occasions where plants have to respond to stimuli, or maybe they have to engage into an action that requires whole plant integration. They must respond as a unity, as a single plant, and not as a collection of modules interacting. And in these cases, all the modules would have to integrate, so they would have to synchronize their behaviors to respond to this cue. And that's how we would see this pattern of attention. So when they are integrating, when they are synchronizing, the behavior becomes less complex and more regular and more correlated. So I know this can be a bit difficult to understand at first. It's in fact a bit complex. So allow me to do an analogy that could help understanding this. So using Anthony Travava's analogy that plants work as a confederation, a democratic confederation, let's say that we would like to study the behavior of a whole country, for example, like Brazil, which is also a federation. How could you do that? We could place an electrode here at the north of the country, another electrode here at the south, and record everything that is happening in that country throughout time. So which is the behavior of all the citizens at the same time. And what we would notice is that everyone will be doing their own lives. Some Brazilians will be working, some will be riding bikes, meditating, I don't know, writing a book, painting. So if you take the whole of the country, it will be very, very complex because each person will be doing something different at the same time. Also, the energy invested into a particular activity will be very low because everyone will be doing something different. The correlation of those signals will be also very, very small because we usually interact at the same time with just a few people that are around us. And so there is not much, our actions usually don't impact the lives of many other people. As a result, we would see that there is not much energy in those signals. They will be very, very complex and unpredictable and very loosely correlated. However, when the World Cup comes and every Brazilian hopes to win the Hexa again, this situation changes. So when there is a game and the Brazil team is playing, the behavior of the whole country would be different. So because everyone will be gathered in front of televisions and watching the match. So what we would observe that the behavior of the whole country would be much more predictable because everyone is doing the same thing at the same time. We also would observe that it's much more regular. So you can accompany what is going on depending on what's happening to the game. The correlation of the signals would be increased because everything that happens in the game will have an impact in the whole nation, basically. So they would cheer at each goal, they would suffer at each penalty. And the energy invested in one specific activity will be much greater because everyone will be doing the same thing. So in this case, we would observe a decrease in complexity because everyone is doing the same thing, an increase in regularity, an increase in the correlation, and an increase in the energy of those signals. So we could say that the whole country is paying attention to one thing. And the same could work as an analogy for plants. So what is World Cup game for Brazil could be a plant trying to solve, I don't know, drought stress, which requires the whole integration of the plant, or a climbing plant growing towards a support, which requires the whole plant to organize its movements very synchronically to grasp the support. So I hope this analogy helps to understand why plant attention as an electrophysiological phenomenon would be observed with that pattern that we described. But yeah, of course, we questioned ourselves, okay, is this something specific to the daughter plant, the cuscuta, or is this a general phenomenon that every plant would present? So we revisited several papers we published using the same techniques with different species. For instance, soybean plants, the daughter plants, bean plants, and tomato plants, and analyzed each of those parameters after several different stimuli that would require whole plant attention. And what was very interesting is that overall, we noticed the same pattern to every species. So when there is a challenge a plant has to face, there is an increase in the energy of the signals, an increase in the regularity, a decrease in the complexity, and an increase in the autocorrelation. So that likely is a general behavior for plants, and this could be a form, a way of studying plant attention empirically. So if you observe this, when the plant is facing something, they could be paying attention. That could be a way of doing that. We published this research in a very interesting and collaborative work with people from several different backgrounds, where we propose plant attention as a phenomenological and empirical hypothesis with plant physiologists, physicists, a psychologist, a philosopher, and a behavioral ecologist. So all those findings are described in this paper that I think John will share with you later. But there is one thing that is missing in what I said, which is the dimension of time. because in those, if we observe plant attention, it is likely not to last forever, and actually it's likely to be very or relatively rare in the environment, because, as I said, the normal state of plants is being dispersed in several modules interacting with the environment. And those events that require the integration of the whole plant are relatively rare. It's just when a plant have to solve something like resisting drought, like growing or flowering or something. But that's the exception and not the rule. So a more recent paper published last year from the same team showed very interesting this effect of time. So basically we stimulated bean plants with fire or wounding and recorded the electron of a leaf near the stimulus and a leaf away from the stimulus. And for that, we used a analysis called time dispersion analysis of features, which is an analysis developed by the LACEV team in Pelotas that shows how those parameters vary throughout time. And what was very interesting was noticing that, in fact, after those stimuli, the plant followed exactly what the hypothesis of plant attention predicts they would do, but just in the first 15 minutes or so. So this is a graph showing variations in those parameters before in green and after in blue. And you can see that it's just in the first few minutes that the plant pays attention to what is happening, maybe as a form of integrating all the modules, like distributing the information about that. And once it's kind of solved, then the plant goes back to its normal state. So the time is very important for observing a plant attention. And that's important when doing those studies, because, as I said, a climbing plant growing likely requires attention only until holding the support. And after that, it can be more plant again. Or, for example, plants learning by habituation, like this study by Galliano and colleagues showed. So they showed that the sensitive plant can learn to ignore innocuous stimuli after a period of training. So originally, a stimulus would cause the plants to close the leaves, because that's how they protect themselves. So it's a stimulus that requires attention from the plant. But after a while, after like touching the plant or leaving the pots drop several times, the plant learns that this is a benign stimulus that won't change anything for them. So maybe the stimulus doesn't require attention again. So we wouldn't observe this. For learning for association, which is another way of learning that Galliano and colleagues showed pea plants could do, it's the opposite. Because when some organism learns by association, it learns to associate a stimulus that normally wouldn't cause any effect, it's a neutral stimulus, to a stimulus that causes a physiological effect. So basically, the plant would perceive something, but ignore it because it's just a stimulus. In this case, was wind. But after a period of training, it starts to respond to this stimulus. So this stimulus would recruit the plant's attention after this period of training. So we again see this dimension of time. So just for wrapping up, attention in plants is, first of all, a hypothesis we've been proposing. So there are some studies corroborating this, but it's very little to accept this as a scientific fact. But it's a hypothesis that makes sense, at least for me, and I'm very fond of it. And what is very interesting is that plants would not always be paying attention as a whole organism. So individual modules could be paying attention, but the whole plant as a whole organism would rarely be in a state of attention. It would likely just do it only when it needs to get together, respond to something, and then go back to its normal state, which is a kind of dispersion. So plants oscillate between this unity and then as a multiplicity of different modules. And I find this very poetic because plants are very symmetrical to humans in a sense. So we breathe oxygen, they breathe, and we release CO2. They breathe CO2 and release oxygen. And also for this, for attention, we humans normally are paying attention all the time throughout the day in our daily activities. So we are always focusing in one thing at the time. And only occasionally we allow ourselves to disperse ourselves, to distract, and our attention is scattered. And the plants would be likely the opposite. So they have this attention scattered around, and sometimes they would focus their own attention into something they need to. So that's a hypothesis. We are still doing studies on this, and we hope we find more results. And I hope this inspires more scientists to pursue this hypothesis of plant attention. So thank you very much for your attention. And thanks again, John and Francis, for the invitation to talk about this.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, André, for an inspiring and just a brilliant presentation, a great example of science communication, translating complex ideas into very accessible information. So we thank you so much. We'll have time for questions after our second presenters. So thank you so much, André, and we look forward to engaging with you in the Q&A period. So with that, let me introduce our second speaker today, Isis Brook, who completed her PhD on Goethean science and Husserlian phenomenology. She taught philosophy for over 25 years, mainly environmental philosophy and aesthetics at Lancaster University and the University of Central Lancashire. Isis is now a visiting researcher at Bath Spa University and also the deputy editor of the new journal Plant Perspectives. So welcome, Isis. I will project your slides and then we'll be able to go in just one moment.
Thanks, John. I'll give you an indication of when to change the slides. There's not many, so don't worry.
Okay, fantastic. All right. Great.
Great. So hello, everyone, and thank you, John and Francis, for the invitation. What an amazing talk from André about the what he's finding out about plant attending. So what I want to do, I see there's some things coming in on chat. I'm afraid I find it very difficult to watch chat and talk and look at my notes and things at the same time. So I'll have to come back to those. What I want to do is just to talk a little bit about phenomenology. Big subject, big area of philosophy. So I'm not going to say very much about it, but I thought what I would focus on a bit is the way in which Goethe was working and the idea of working in that way. Then I've got some kind of questions, and I've got a little exercise for people to do, which is why I asked you to have a house plant or a plant or plant material available. And I just wanted to start off with one very quick thing, which is I'm hoping everyone can see me on the screen as well as the screen. So I'm going to hold up something. And it's just to do a quick example of what Husserl called extended horizons. So we're going to dive straight in because we don't have time to lay out the history of phenomenology or anything. So I just want to hold this up. Oops. So yeah. So I hope you can see that okay. So I have the weird thing that my screen is, my video feed is flipped left to right. So anyway, so I hope you can see that, what that is, fir cone. And what I want to point out is that when you see the fir cone there, oops, sorry, you see a fir cone, okay, but there are a number of things which Husserl would have called extended horizons, things that you're bringing along with the seeing of the fir cone. And the first most obvious one is that you think that's a solid object. I think. I think you have assumed that's a solid object. There are other things you might have assumed about it as well. So if we were in a room and I were to throw it across to you, you would have an expectation about the kind of weight it would be, the hardness it would be. You would have an idea of the sound it would make if one tapped it. And those are all implied. They're all kind of assumptions that are built on the seeing of the fir cone. I could turn the fir cone round and it might be one that's been cut in half and show a cross section. Whereas I think that you probably think that it's a solid fir cone all the way around, which it is actually. Sorry, this left-right thing is getting to me. Yeah, so it is a solid fir cone. Okay, so the idea there was really to do with Husserl's early work in phenomenology and the idea that we need to interrogate our experience. And when we interrogate our experience, whatever the experience is, he said a phenomenon, and a phenomenon for him is anything whatsoever. So when we interrogate our experience, we see that there are numerous aspects of it which we are bringing to the perception. So we have the perception, but we're bringing lots of things along to the perception. Somebody holding up a fir cone in a talk, sort of nature-orientated talk, it's likely to be a real fir cone, not a plastic one or something. But these are all things that are brought along with. You could change the slide now, John. So one of the things that phenomenology was starting to do, this is early 20th century with Husserl, one of the things it's starting to do is to really do that interrogation and to start to observe the inner processes of thought that are going on when we see something. Apologies for that not being the right tree to see. That doesn't match the fir cone. That's a cedar of Lebanon. So, but of course, another thing we could be seeing in the fir cone is the kind of where it's from. We could be bringing along to the perception or where that thing is from, what sort of organism it could become in the future. These are all things that we are bringing to the raw perception. And it's not that any of those things are wrong or misguided or silly or anything like that. Is what Husserl is wanting us to do is just to observe that is what's happening. And if we are going to arrive at understandings of things, we need to sometimes unpeel, to sort of dig down and unpeel what's going on. Okay. Can I just suggest you might want to just write a note, if you haven't already, just about what you brought along to the fir cone observation. You might want to just jot a note down there. You could put it in the chat if you want to. But anyway, we're going to do a longer exercise, and I just thought it might be useful to kind of have that little note first. So if we change the slide, I'm now going to jump back 100 years to Goethe, because I think that when we look at Goethe's scientific work, I think that what's going on there is a kind of proto-phenomenology. Goethe was starting to get to some of the same, or some of the ideas which Husserl later developed. So Goethe's a German poet, as you would probably know, but he felt his scientific work was of greater importance than his poetry. History thought otherwise. But there's a particular way in which Goethe is working, which I think is important for us if we are trying to understand understand plants and understand them as plants. And so we're starting to find out via scientific methods, amazing stuff about how plants react in the environment, what their capacities are, what their senses are. All of this kind of material is really, really useful. And when Goethe was working, at the time he was working, botany at the time was very much about taxonomy, about getting things in the right boxes, finding methods. He started trying to work with Linnaeus's approach, and found it wasn't really getting at what he understood of plants. He wanted to get to something that was actually how does nature do plant? It would be a way of talking about it. And then he goes on, he does various experiments, and he sees plants in different places. He goes on a journey to Italy particularly, and it's in his journey to Italy that he has some quite profound insights about the plant world, if you like. And what I find quite interesting in reading, when we read Goethe, is that there's very much the sense of somebody tuning into plants and having the plant lead him to a different way of seeing. And then there's a quote there from his essay on morphology. Goethe is the person who coined the term morphology, where he says, if we wish to arrive at some living perception of nature, we ourselves must remain as quick and flexible as nature and follow the example she gives. And this is like a little snapshot of the idea that or the way in which he's working. And then he calls his approach, as he works out a kind of a method to approach anything. He did work on colour and on osteology, other aspects of science. But I think it was the plant. I think it was working with the plant that really led him into this different way of approaching things. And he called his overall approach delicate empiricism. Questions about empiricism would have been very alive at the time he was working, skepticism about it. New slide. So we've got in Goethe's work, we've got what he called Anschauung. Sorry, I don't have German, so I can't pronounce that properly. A translation of that by Agnes Arber is intuitive knowledge gained through contemplation of the visible aspect. And I think by visible aspect we could say sensible aspect. So the how the plant feels and the smell and the taste and everything. So not just visible. So he's arriving at a kind of plant-informed perception. And new slide. And this comes down to a form of what's now called Goethean study method. So a way of working. And it's a way of working through a disciplined process of approaching the plant using our full human faculties. Each builds on the previous one to arrive at a form of a kind of objective subjectivity, a being with the plant on as close as its own terms as possible. This was sort of what he's working towards and what Goethean study now is about. Right. Just looking at the time. Okay. So the Goethean, I've put down there, this takes a long time. So this process of working through this form of study with a particular plant or a particular landscape, or plants in a landscape. Oh, I should have said, one of the things that Goethe mentioned, or one of the things that kind of triggered his different way of thinking was seeing plants in a new environment and seeing that they grew in a completely different way. This was very different from the idea of there being a standard plant captured in a herbarium sample that is how that plant is. he was starting to see that if it's in a different climate, under different conditions, it grows in a very different way. And that the whole landscape, all the plants of the landscape kind of have similar features in the way in which they grow there as opposed to somewhere else. So out of Goethe's work, we can identify these different sort of stages that he talks about, and they're basically ways of working in this disciplined way through different types of perceiving. So on the next slide, we've got a breakdown of these. So these are the stages and the kind of human faculties that are emphasized in each. What comes through quite nicely in Goethe's science compared to late 19th, early 20th century science is a complete rejection of the idea that the human being with the human capacities, human sensibilities, isn't relevant here. We're not trying to kind of get to an understanding of the plant outside of how a human being can experience a plant. But to get there, we need to identify initially some of the first impressions and some of the kind of this is a kind of self-examination of assumptions. Like we might have had our assumptions about the fir cone. So one of the ways in which we can approach a plant, you see, you can take the example of a weed plant, we kind of, a dandelion or nettles or something, we might have particular feelings about those plants, because we might have been battling with them for years in a garden. And that will give us a particular presupposition about the nature of that plant. But a lot of that is us. It's about us. It's about our wants and our desires and our needs. It's not about the plant at all. So one of the things in Goethean science, one of the things you're trying to do is to kind of step outside of that. You're trying to bracket some of those assumptions, some of those things that you are bringing to the plant. So in the first instance, we're trying to get rid of a kind of unschooled subjectivity, a kind of just raw subjectivity. And then we're going to work in terms of going through a process to arrive at a much clearer perception of the plant as the thing it is. And what's interesting, I think, with this process is that it is a joint journey between yourself and the plant or the landscape that you're working with. It is a journey, it's something you're undertaking together. But at the same time, there's a kind of a clarity about it. And that's probably, it's probably enough just to start thinking about some of these stages. And what I want to do, because we haven't got, when I was first learning this approach, we were taking about 9 days to work through these different stages, and we have about 10 minutes. So what I wanted to do was just to kind of get you to have a sense of a shift in consciousness. Okay, now there are plenty of other ways we could do that, but I want to do it through this work and through this work with a plant. So if we have the next slide, I've just got a couple of instructions there. So this is a mini experiment with shifts in consciousness. And I want you to bring your focus to your plant, whatever it might be that you have there. And the first thing, which is really that kind of pre-stage, is just to note something down that you realize that you are bringing along with the plant. An attitude, an assumption, something that comes with you. And I see somebody's just saying 10 days sounds right. I have a similar experience. So yeah, I think so. But anyway, you've got your plant. So I have my plant here. And one of the things I'm bringing along to my feelings about, at the moment I'm writing a paper on plant ethics, and one of the things that pops up in that is bonsai trees. And so I've got my bonsai tree here, and I'm trying to focus on my bonsai tree, but at the same time I'm thinking about my paper and all of the other things. So that's kind of in the background. So with your plant, just note down something that you realise you're bringing along. And then once you've got that and you've put it out there, by noting it down, you kind of put it to one side. You can bracket it in the phenomenological language of putting to one side, which Husserl calls bracketing. And then you can return to observing your plant. And I want to give you a few minutes just to do that, just to really settle down and focus on the plant, but in this specific way. I want you to focus on your plant as if it is a static object frozen in time, and just do a very detailed observation. So we've only got time for, just a tiny bit of it, a leaf junction or something like that, or a node, or the way the leaf emerges, something about it, some detail, and do a little drawing. It's only when you start drawing something that you see you've missed some detail about it. Give you a couple of, well, what should we do? 2 minutes, okay? Okay, so that's your 2 minutes, replacing 3 or 4 days of detailed work. What I want to do now is just to, if we get the next slide up, So this is the mini experiment continued. I want you now, just very briefly, to shift your focus to the plant as a growing, changing, living entity. You can observe if a different part of yourself seems to be needed to move with that. And then, as a way of engaging with that, you might want to just close your eyes, think of the part you've just been seeing, you've just been looking at in detail. Can you grow that? Can you imagine what it's going to be like in a week's time, 2 weeks' time, a year's time? So this is a way of engaging the imagination, but very tied to the close observation that you've been doing. Okay, so we'll finish the experiment there, except that you have the opportunity to write anything down. But I think one of the things that happens, and this is this shift in consciousness, these shifts in consciousness which feature in the different stages of the Goethean process, I think we can see in that first one, between 1 and 2, why the plant was so crucial in Goethe kind of realizing that you could work like this. And I think it's because, for me anyway, I'm sorry we don't have kind of time to go around and get things, but do put them in the chat. For me anyway, it's a real relief to move into that shift, to see the plant as a growing thing. Because it's like when you're trying to do that first stage, to see it as static, there's a resistance in the plant being seen like that. It's a struggle to kind of keep it there. If you describe the plant, when you describe it with other people, if you were doing that first stage with a group, you might be describing it, and it's very easy to slip into language of growing, wilting, future states, past states, instead of saying we're just going to look at how it is. And so observing that the plant is drawing you into that movement tells us something very crucial about the plant, not something we didn't know, obviously, but we're kind of feeling our way into it. And I said on there, how does that feel compared to the static observing? And we could ask, where in yourself do you have to kind of shift your attention to do that? Where, is there a bodily shift in moving from one way of looking to another way of looking? What's going on in you that allows you to do that, to make that shift? So I hope that has kind of done something to kind of give a sense of this. So it never, I always feel like, well, this doesn't do justice to Goethean science, because you need your 9 days and you need to be engaged in this long process of, really dealing with the plant. There are plenty of records, accounts of people doing this and work doing this, so you could read those, and you could have a go yourself over a longer period. I keep wanting to change the slide on my computer. John, can you change the slide? Thanks. Right. So one of the things about it being taking a long time is other approaches to meeting plants are available. And 3 others I've tried are plant dreaming, which I do once a month with somebody called Lucy Vogler. Nature constellations, which some people might have heard of, and wild scribe writing, using creative writing. And with all of those, what interests me, the plant dreaming I've been doing for a number of years, and that seems to approach something more, it's more like a sort of shamanic approach. And one of the things that I found happening there is that it works much more quickly. And profound responses. Profound things can happen in terms of our insights into plants and in insights into ourselves. It seems to me that with those others, insights into oneself are more the fruits of it, if you see what I mean. We do have insights into nature, into the plant realm, via those approaches. But what I particularly liked about the Goethe approach when I discovered, that it was out there and I learned how to do it, working with Margaret Cahoon particularly, was just how fitting it was to a Western a Western sort of normal conception, and the way in which you needed to move away from that. It was a kind of a stepped way of moving away from that. But it was very diligent about sticking with the plant. Yes, so I said, suggest things, and other people are suggesting other routes and other ways of working with plants, which somehow take you into the plant realm, take you into a sense of being with a plant. So there are lots of them out there. There's some resources on the next slide, which are just a few texts on working with plants in this Goethean approach. Something on phenomenology, if people are interested. And I've put my own website there because there's quite a few papers on Goethean science. They're basically all about, working through this method. Those are there. The next slide just says questions. So I'm happy to leave it there, John, and see what questions have come up or where we move on to.
That's great. That's a perfect point to wrap up. Thank you so much, Isis, for such an engaging and transformative presentation. I think this method can be profound for all of us in our relation to plants. So thank you so much. We now have plenty of time, about 25 to 30 minutes for questions. So feel free to write your question in the chat or to unmute your mic and ask your question. And it can also be more of a statement if you'd like to present anything you've come to through the information and exercises presented by André and Isis today. So feel free. I'll just check if there's any questions in the chat that we can get started with. Okay, great. And you may use your Zoom hand in the chat as well if you'd like to raise a question. That works too. I'd be happy to get one question going to get started. And that is for both André and Isis. Oh, let's, Francis, good. You can get started instead. You have a question, Francis, please.
Yeah, thanks, John. Hello, Isis and André, and thank you very much for your presentations. I read one of each of your papers this morning, and what came to mind is this kind of idea about questions about what happens after death, and seeing how plants die, or a lot of species of plant. We're very aware of that here in the winter time, because it's so cold and long, that these plants die as they do and then are reborn again in the spring. Symbolically, the root stays alive. If we could conceptualize the root as the soul, would there be any comparisons with what happens to human beings, seen as we're a part of nature? Also, this great mystery of what lies between the death and then, if there is such a thing as reincarnation or rebirth, whether or not you feel, because we are also a part of nature, and we see something similar that happens with trees, whereas plants can fall down or just dissolve, rot away, depending on what they are made up of, water. When we look at trees, they don't necessarily die in that way. The leaves may fall off the deciduous trees. They're bare, but yet still that root system again gives birth gives birth again in the springtime. And one of the things that I thought was quite interesting, I read about Goethe's philosophy regarding connections with the 4 different elements, looking at plants through the 4 different elements, nettle, dandelion and vervain, in the paper I read at the weekend, and how those kind of 4 different elements also correspond with the different seasons of like, if we say winter in the north, and earth, and then spring with the air, water with autumn, and then fire with summertime. And this, again, this kind of cosmology. And I wondered whether or not in your studies, any of these questions have, it probably sounds a bit complicated, but whether or not any of these questions have come to mind, because it's a big subject, it's a big topic, but I think plants may be able to inform us to some extent about that transition between life, death, and if rebirth actually happens at some point in the future. So any comments, any feedback you could give, it would be great. Thank you.
I can go first with this, but I think André, with his modularity point, can also probably come in. But one of the things, when you were first talking about death, one of the things that death and rebirth, one of the things that remind me of some of the experiences, and particularly with plant dreaming, I've had experiences where a particular plant might become a way in which one can imagine oneself being under the earth, and moving under the earth, moving in the same way that the plant is moving and bifurcating through the root system. And in terms of, thinking that in one's normal conscious state, that would be very disturbing. But as a journey with a plant, it becomes it's fine. It's perfectly fine. And it's perfectly fine to imagine oneself being just basically dissolving under the earth. So in a sense there. What do you think, André?
Well, I like this word dissolving, because that's what we observe with the electrum when plants are paying attention. So likely there is this gathering and then there's dissolving of attention. And I always wonder how it feels to the plant, if any. So if they have a subjective feeling, how would be this coming and going of their attention? So like when that baseline we see in the electrical signaling is not random, so that's a baseline plants have, so they have this all the time. But when plants are dying, like actually not only plants but everyone, when we die, one of the first symptoms is the disintegration of this electrical signaling of this baseline that accompanies us. So yeah, probably they just dissolve. And also when they go dormant in winter and come back in spring, it would be fascinating to understand how those shifts happen with the plant, within the plant. So yeah, I think we can learn a lot about even ourselves by studying the plants in their own terms.
Yeah. And that resonance with the plant as well, when you, like the first snowdrop of spring, the kind of heartfelt response to that, of hope, of joy, of something coming. It's that's a very direct connection with a plant. And a plant which, when you spend time with it, you realize is not a delicate thing at all. It's a powerful plant.
Yeah, when they burst in life in spring, it's so beautiful, and you can actually see all this life coming back, all this explosion of maybe attention as well when they organize their activities to make the leaves again.
Mm.
Yes, thank you. And what comes to mind there, if I can just briefly explain, is that, you know, what André was talking about, plant attention. There's got to be that attention that when the winter is receding and the warmth is coming, that like here at the moment, we've had a lot of rain this last week or so after the snow's cleared away, which is going to initiate that new life in the ground. And so plants must have that attention that it's time now to start regenerating. And again, there's a change from that element of winter, that earth element, now to one of air in the springtime, but also one of water, which is the rain that's coming, and then the sun, which is the fire, which will inevitably you know, help with this regrowth process. So I find these kind of like interlocking or interconnecting features really quite interesting.
Oh yeah.
But thank you for your feedback.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that fascinating discussion. And we have a question from Elizabeth. Given the current Western mindset about plant function and utility, how can this information presented today be built upon to benefit plant communities? Isis, André, please.
Should I start maybe this time?
Certainly, yeah, please.
Yeah, I find so one of the greatest benefits of those studies in plant cognition and plant intelligence is that we start to admire plants for what they are and not as just objects that we use. So I think it creates this connection with plants, with nature in general. I think this is a kind of a portal that allows us to understand that every organism is unique and have their own experiences and their own lives, which are valuable on their own, because they also have their own experiences as themselves. I'm not saying that they are necessarily conscious, but they have somehow a kind of subjectivity, as we observe with the plant electrum. And I think that this is very, very beneficial to even conservation, for example, because how would someone kill a plant or a big tree or something, or even a whole forest, if one really feels that plants and every organism there is not an object? They are living organisms interacting with themselves, with other plants, with other organisms, with the environment, and so on. So I think one of the greatest benefits would be changing this mindset that everything in nature is just objects, to no, they are actually living organisms just like me, and they deserve respect just like me.
Thank
Isis?
you. And Isis, please.
Yeah, Isis, can you repeat the question for me?
Oh, certainly. Given the current Western mindset about plant function and utility, how can the information presented today be built upon to benefit plant communities?
Right, yes. Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And I think one of the things that bracketing exercise, where you're looking at assumptions and things you bring, one of the things that we bring when we look at plants is their utility, is their, looking at vegetables, for example, but also even ornamental plants, a sense of wanting them to be how we want them to be, having our idea of how they should be. And I think that part of the approach of actually attending to plants as plants, rather than our ciphers of plants that we might be working with, is identifying exactly that, identifying exactly those things. I can remember once being living somewhere where it was important to be able to collect firewood And so I was always looking out for dead branches on trees to take, because we were allowed to take the dead branches. So you start you're going through woodland, and you'll start, instead of looking at the trees or, you know, the majesty of the trees or you're just looking for dead branches because that's what you're tuned, that's what you're attending to. You're attending to this use value. And I think it was one day doing that, and then I came across quite a young, perfectly shaped, it was just beautiful hawthorn tree, and just seeing, and the light on it, and the leaves were just coming out in this really bright green, and just that broke through. So that broke through my attending for firewood, and sort of switched into actually receiving a plant as a plant, you know, sort of just kind of being there with the plant, rather than having this kind of utility mindset of, you know, what can I get from this kind of end gaining approach to it. And I think it is sometimes it's the plant that shocks us out of that. The plant that sometimes is doing something that you didn't plan for it to do in the garden or something, and then it's the agency of the plant is suddenly, you know, brings us up and makes us think, oh, you know, you've done that. Wasn't what I had planned, but wow, that's amazing. And so there are instances where the plant sort of shocks us out of that mindset. And in terms of the sort of wider, you know, it's okay for us who've signed up for coming along here, you know. But other people where plants really are just background, how do we get them to notice plants? One of the things that's going on within plant ethics is very much, I mean, it's a double-edged sword where we demonstrate how much like humans plants are, that they have similar attributes. That worked very well in terms of plant ethics, in terms of widening people's understanding of what was morally relevant in terms of animals feeling pain. One of the problems with doing that in plant ethics is the more we focus on how much plants are like humans, the more we're not focusing on how they're really not like humans at all, and they're really very, very different and have very different life, a very different way of being, a way of living, which is something we should be honouring and respecting and finding out more about, and coming to not an accommodation. I don't mean that. I mean more a sort of coming into a kind of a co-being with them as the beings they are, not as beings that happen to have some attributes that are a bit like us, but as the whole thing, you know, the whole plant, the whole way in which not only we've heard about the plant modularity, but also the way in which plants as a whole are kind of connected as well. We separate them when we put them in pots and things, but they're kind of still all somehow connected with other members of their species and other members of the plant realm. So I am just going on. Something like that.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Isis. Thank you, Andrew. We have a question from Vitalia, please. Vitalia.
Thank you. I think, Isis, you've been bringing this question, how does nature does plants? I think this question, what comes up by asking this question, I think we always turn into ourselves, no? How does nature, does humans, because how even in studies, how we study plants, our human perceptions are still very important. So my question is, how do we combine this studies of human perception and plant perception? Because for me, they feel to be very intertwined. And and yet sometimes it feels that they are still very separated, that there are people who study plants, plant perceptions, and people who study human perceptions, and they don't necessarily meet in these studies. So yes, question for both of you, how do you see this, what are possibilities for meeting and discussing and maybe researching together to also avoid these biases or these worldviews that we can impose on certain studies?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to hear André on this, but just to say that in terms of critical plant studies, environmental humanities, all of the work that's done in a very cross-disciplinary way or interdisciplinary way is very exciting in the ways in which it can bring those things together. And I think that sort of going back to the Goethean thing, going back to that seemed to me to be an amazingly early effort in thinking that through, in trying to arrive at ways of thinking about how you do science in a way that actually uses the human capacities to explore whatever it is that we want to look at, without bringing aspects that we don't want to bring, if you see, without bringing our normal way, like the utility, the focus on utility, without bringing that along, or if it's there, acknowledging it's there, putting it to one side and meeting the plant for the plant. But what do you think, André? Because you've been collaborating.
Yes, so
with
that's
philosophers.
an interesting question because it relates with all the collaborations ahead. So I think we shouldn't ever impose human values onto plants, because plants are plants. They're different. They have their own body plans, their own evolutive history, and so you should try to understand plants on their own terms, how they would interact, like from their perspective, as much as possible. Which doesn't mean that we can't use, for example, human studies as a departing point, because I think humans are the best studied species in the world. So sometimes we can start from there, but try to understand plants. So we've been collaborating, for example, with Umberto Castiello. He's a psychologist from the university.
We lost André, but here you're back, André.
Oh, I'm back. So yeah, so everything. So my connection is unstable. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're back.
So I was saying, we had this collaboration with Umberto Castiello. He's a psychologist who studied humans for several years before turning into plants and trying to adapt some studies he did with humans, but with plants. Also, Monica Gagliano, she studied fish behavior for several years before using this knowledge to study plants, but obviously developing experiments that make sense from this plant perspective. So yeah, I think this interdisciplinarity is very, very important, but we should avoid anthropomorphizing plants and rather understanding plants how they are and not how we wish they are.
Thank you both for responding. We have a question from Aileen in the chat, and Aileen writes, I have a half-formed thought about attending attention to plants and time. How do we do this when we don't have enough time, or rather don't spend enough time in a single place to do justice to the work of attending? I agree with Goethe and Isis that it takes time, but I'm also very aware that an average career in academia and art and other fields as well requires us to be flexible, to travel, to move quite often. So how do we attend to plants when we are time poor or time constrained in a modern world? Isis or André, please.
can I start? So, well, I think plants teach us that we shouldn't be so hurried all the time. So that's a human thing. And I know modern world is very overwhelming with like several things we have to do. Like I'm doing a PhD, so I know very well how those times constraints are. But as much as we can, I think trying to slow down and just admire a plant like Isis proposed in this exercise, or like doing some gardening and trying to slow down, because yeah, plants are slow, but that's a good thing. They just do everything in time, and in the end I think we manage to create those pockets of time, sometimes just to do some garden, or just to stop and drink a cup of tea and admire nature or garden or something. What do you think, Isis?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's really it's partly the intention. It's having the intention to say, okay, this week I'm not going to do the crossword. I'm going to spend that time with a plant, or I'm going to, I've got a plant at the moment that, I've got questions about it, and so I'll try and make some time, and spend some time with it, as you would, like you would with a friend that you want to find out more about. But I think that's it. But I think that I recall being a very busy academic, and I'm supposed to be retired now, but I still feel very busy. But I think things like just, making the decision that, if you've got to walk somewhere, say you walk to the shops or you walk to work, or if you have some time when you're walking, you can just make the decision that I'm not going to be thinking about X, Y, and Z. I'm going to be noticing plants today, or I'm going to be noticing a particular sort of plant today. I'm going to be noticing trees today. And that can have, even if you had no interest in plants particularly, you just wanted to, have some meditation or something, or, calm down, it would be very useful. But doing it in terms of saying, I want to come to know these trees that I pass every day on my way to work, so I'm going to notice them. Mm-hmm. And amazing things can just start happening from that. Just some little thing to start, and then,
Furthermore, I find fascinating how the perception of time is relative. So when we are attentive to something, when we pay attention, like we stop 1-2 minutes to pay attention, sometimes this time seems to take ages, and that's a pocket of time you create in your busy life. So for example, when you proposed this exercise of admiring a plant, I was just looking at one out of the window, and I was so distracted seeing the form, because it's a very beautiful plant. It looks like a coral or something, and it's blooming now with several butterflies coming. And when you said, oh, okay, 2 minutes passed, then, oh, was this 2 minutes? I thought it was like 5 or 10 minutes, because it was just 2 minutes. So when you're plenty fully aware, like attentive to something, which when you try to disconnect from other thoughts and like being present, we can create those small pockets of time in our daily life. And I think plants are very helpful at this. They definitely help us creating this time.
Thank you. We'll have just one more question on the subject of seeds. So Margio writes, going back to the subject of dying and rebirth, has someone studied what kind of attention native seeds have start of growing when certain signals are functioning and so forth? So has there been much research on attention in seeds?
Well, I'm not aware of any studies on attention on seeds, but I think seeds are must be very attentive. So they are dormant for a while, but they need to be monitoring the environment all the time, because they make decisions in the end. So a seed, when it starts to get wet and starts to perceive the environment, it has to integrate a lot of information. So paying attention to light, how the light are, the humidity, temperature, to decide if it will germinate or not. And this is also a process that is irreversible once it starts. So I think seeds would need a lot of attention as well. We tend to think of seeds as something kind of dead or dormant, but actually they are very active metabolically, especially when they are hydrated and ready to germinate. So yeah, and that's an activity that requires, likely, if plant attention is a thing, because this is a hypothesis, a lot of attention to the environment and to decide the best moment to start germinating.
Thank you. Thank you so much, André. Well, that's the time that we have for this magnificent discussion. So fascinating. And I'd like to turn over the floor to my colleague, Francis Joy, just to wrap up today's session. Please, Francis.
Yes, thank you. On behalf of myself and John and our Sentient Forest project, thank you very much to André and Isis. And I'd also like to just make a reminder that we have one of our presenters, Lydia, is holding a seminar in 2 days' time. We have information about that. I don't know whether we could post it in the chat or not, but anyway, please keep connected to us. We've got lots of interesting things going on. We have a retreat in Akaswampalo next month with a group of 13 of us to study forest plant intelligence and sentience. And we've just already this weekend produced a video so about our work, about the project that we're doing. So that will also be available. But thank you very much, everybody, for your attention. And we hope that you'll come and join us again.